Good morning and welcome to the webinar. We are live and direct from the Berkeley campus of the University of California, Mulford Hall. Good morning to you. This is Land Acquisition and Ecosystem Carbon in Coastal California, and we're glad you can join us. I'm Bruce Reardon. I'm the Program Director for the Climate Readiness Institute, and Isabel Schroeder here at Berkeley is at the controls. CRI brings together academics and climate practitioners for research projects, workshops, other activities about the critical climate issues facing California and the Bay Area. You can find out more about CRI at climatereadinessinstitute.org or follow us now on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Agenda slide. We have a pretty straightforward agenda. We're going to take about 35-40 minutes for the project team to walk you through the project goals, the methods, and the products, and then another 20-25 minutes for your questions and answers and discussion. In the Q&A, as you know, there are a lot of different ways, different methodologies that could be used for this topic. And you'll be hearing about the approach we're going to take in this project today. So we don't want to get into a big debate in the Q&A on the methodology, but we do want to hear your clarifying questions so you understand how we're approaching this and the products that we're going to produce, because we'd like to also hear either today or afterwards via email, how could these products best help your work in California going forward? A couple of ground rules. One, thank you for muting your phones. And two, please use the chat function on the GoToMeeting bar to submit your questions, and Isabel and I will review them and feed them on to the team. The California State Coastal Conservancy is sponsoring this research, so here to get us started is the Conservancy's Hillary Willeka. Welcome, Hillary.
Hi, everyone. Welcome from the Coastal Conservancy. For those of you who don't know, the State Coastal Conservancy is a non-regulatory agency that has played a critical role in conserving California's coastal landscapes. The Conservancy has preserved hundreds of thousands of acres of wildlife habitat, coastal farmlands, and scenic open space. And the motivation for the Coastal Conservancy for starting this project was to determine how significant the carbon sequestration benefit has been from the land the Conservancy has put into conservation, and be able to quantify it for future acquisitions and help with other applications outside the Conservancy's work. We think it's going to get really informative results and are excited to be working with this great team. So thanks, Bruce.
Great. Thanks, Hillary. Thanks for being here. David Ackerley is Professor of Integrative Biology here at Berkeley and the leader of this project. And David this morning is going to lead us through the presentation. Here's David.
Good morning. Welcome all. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give a brief overview and then be handing over the mic to several of my colleagues to talk about different parts of the project. So as you all know, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere is a subject of enormous interest, both locally in the state and globally. And California is establishing itself as a real leader in really trying to get on a trajectory to reduce our carbon emissions. A lot of that work is, of course, in the transportation and energy sectors, but the terrestrial land mass also has a role to play here. And as we'll discuss, terrestrial ecosystems have a critical role in the carbon cycle. The purpose of this project, in collaboration with the Coastal Conservancy, is to focus on one set of land acquisitions, and those which we'll show in a moment, and look at the question of what those acquisitions have contributed to ecosystem carbon stocks and fluxes, and focusing especially on a 10-year period for which some critical analyses are available, and then applying some other methodologies to look ahead to the future as well. So what we'll talk about here is both a set of principles about how to do this work and also the details of how we're applying it to the Coastal Conservancy. We've been really fortunate to put together a great team to work on this of Berkeley faculty. You'll see there on the left, Bruce Reardon representing CRI and Patrick Gonzalez from the National Park Service, who's done really critical work in this area in the past and is contributing that to our work today. And all of us are, of course, the not good or not so good looking faces, depending on your point of view, because below it are the names of the people who are actually delivering a lot of the real substance of what we're doing. Some students and technicians in our labs who are doing really excellent and critical work on this project. So the basic questions we are trying to understand here is the role of terrestrial ecosystems in the carbon footprint. And in the case of acquisitions, such as on the left, we can set aside land, we can prevent it being converted to other uses, and then we have the question about what the consequences of that protection are. But simply setting aside land is not the end of the story, as you all know, and what we do with it going forward and how it's managed is also a critical part of that story. And that can be management through grazing, which is very important on our grasslands, maybe management through timber, stock management, not shown here, harvests and the carbon value of forests, the soil carbon amendment ideas developing, which we'll talk about more later. And then, of course, in the absence of that protection, the possibility that that land might have been converted and and at least some of the carbon that was in that ecosystem lost. If we take here's a quick overview of the Coastal Conservancy's work over the last almost 30 years. On the left, the light green is the legal domain over which the Coastal Conservancy has jurisdiction. And the darker green is the acquisitions over these 30 or so years. Some of those acquisitions are fairly small, so we've taken a little liberty with GIS to have those points pop up so you can see them. But as you see, they're really distributed widely, all the way from San Diego up to the Oregon border. And on the right, what you see is just a quick timeline of it's over 500 acquisitions, a total of 400,000 acres, over 400,000 acres. The biggest single acquisition is the Hearst Ranch on the Central Coast. And collectively, across all of the agencies who are involved in these projects, over $2 billion of investment just to set aside those lands. So for those of you whose ecosystem ecology is not super fresh, just a quick refresher on what we're talking about here. The core question here is the relationship between the carbon in the atmosphere and the carbon in vegetation and below ground in the ecosystem. There's one critical way, or the most important way that carbon gets into the vegetation is through photosynthesis, and that's the key for plants to grow. That's also a process that requires enormous amounts of water. And we see that, of course, during a drought when the ability of plants to take up carbon is severely limited by the lack of water. When that carbon is taken in, it's used for growth, and that growth can then be stored in the ecosystem above ground, most importantly in wood, in trees, such as that giant redwood there, surrounded by a growing plantation coming up around it. But also, really importantly, a lot of that carbon can end up below ground. And the below ground carbon is especially important for long-term stores. It is harder to measure and harder to see, and a challenging topic which really deserves our attention because of its importance. That carbon can then be lost back to the atmosphere. Again, some of it could go up through, in a suburban development project, that vegetation would be cleared and chipped, and it might decompose, it might be burned. We have, of course, wildfires where that carbon is lost. We're having enormous tree death due to the current drought. Eventually, those trees will either burn or fall over and die and decompose. And the carbon in the soil can return to the atmosphere through the activity of microbes and a lot of very important processes happening below ground. But some of that carbon can also get fairly deep down into stores, long-term stores that can be very important at a global scale because they are more buffered and lower chance that they can be released to the atmosphere. So the approach we're taking in this project is to think about the Conservancy acquisitions as they're distributed across climate zones and across vegetation types. And we want to do this because climate and the vegetation, forests or grasslands, play a key role in ecosystem dynamics. So the first thing we wanted was to get a climate map of California so we could ask the question, how are the Conservancy acquisitions distributed across climate types? That led us to discover that we didn't have a climate map of California that served the purpose we wanted. And a graduate student in my lab who's very skilled with these analyses has actually developed some approaches that we hope actually may turn out to be useful beyond this project to just map out the different climate types. And the climate types here would be different winter temperatures, summer temperatures, precipitation. And what you see is something we're all familiar with, the enormous heterogeneity, the ruggedness, the topography of California, including along the coast. And a lot of that is the very important gradients from the cool summer, warm, mild winter right by the water to the much more continental climates inland. So if you look inside the Coastal Conservancy boundary, you see an enormous heterogeneity of different kinds of climates. We can then look at we can do a little histogram exercise. How much of the state falls in different climate types? And these are this looking at the coastal area. Climate type 11, which is that light blue, it's over on the left there, is right along the coast, going from Mendocino down to about almost San Luis Obispo. And it's actually a big part of where Conservancy acquisitions have been, especially Hearst Ranch falls in part in that. So if you look at that big bar on the left, just to say a lot of this area that's been conserved is in one particular climate zone, but it's also distributed across a number of other zones across the coast. And the purpose of our looking at it this way is, to the extent that we can develop generalizations about different kinds of ecosystems in different climates, we can then use this to extrapolate from our results across the entire domain. We'll also be focusing on one example today to help illustrate each step of the project for one specific property. And for that purpose, we'll use Preservation Ranch in northwestern Sonoma County. So this is not the only property we'll be analyzing, of course. This is just an example of the methods that we'll be using and to walk through and look at it on a specific property. So that's a background. There are three components of the actual work, and I'm going to be passing over the mic to three of my colleagues to discuss each one in turn. And the first is an analysis of the land cover and the carbon stocks across this domain, and it will be presented by Patrick Gonzalez.
Good morning. We plan to quantify carbon stocks and changes in the California Coastal Commission parcels by using research that colleagues, including UC Berkeley professor John Battles and I, published last year. To track the state's progress in meeting carbon pollution reduction requirements, the California Air Resources Board conducts periodic inventories of greenhouse gas emissions from cars, power plants, and ecosystems. And the board funded us last year to provide, or in the past few years, to provide a scientifically robust estimate of the ecosystem part. And these are the data sources, basically remote sensing and on-the-ground forest inventories. We quantified carbon at 30-meter spatial resolution. Those are squares, 30 meters on a side. And we validated against independent field-based carbon estimates. All those data sources fed into one straightforward equation that you see at the top. The carbon in a square of land is equal to the area of that square multiplied by the biomass per square and multiplied by the fraction of that biomass that is carbon. And the rest of the slide that you see are the details of our Monte Carlo analysis, which is a statistical method that basically in which we basically repeated the calculation 100 times, including the different sources of error, inventory measurements, remote sensing error, and statistical variation of the equations. In 2001, the forests, grasslands, wetlands, and other wildland ecosystems of the state contained nearly 1 billion tons of carbon. And you see the detail for Preservation Ranch in the lower left. In 2010, we used the exact same method, and it shows these stocks in the wildland ecosystems. And California is home to ecosystems with the highest carbon densities in the world. The coast redwood forests in redwood national parks contain up to 10 times the amount of carbon per square on the ground as Amazon rainforests. Now, if you switch back between 2001 and 2010, you see some differences. So the next slide will show in great relief the distances. The darkest reds are a decrease of 100 tons per hectare, and the darkest greens are an increase. The increases occur because of growth. The trees or other vegetation get higher, or more vegetation comes in. The brown areas, further analysis showed that a small fraction of the state, 6% of the state that burned in the 9-year period, released 2/3 of the carbon emissions. And on the left, you see the numbers there. And this has also occurred in Preservation Ranch. So for each of the California Coastal Commission parcels, we will extract the carbon stocks for 2001, 2010 that you saw, and the change during that period. And this will reflect the important service that conserving these lands provide.
The second part of this project is what may prove quite an ambitious effort to really address the issue about the land cover and the avoided emissions that come from preventing the conversion of these protected lands to other uses. And that will be presented by Maggie Kelly.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking about what might have happened if these parcels hadn't been preserved. So understanding this avoided emission problem, we really have to think about what might have been on each property. And so to do that, we delve into the appraiser's record when this parcel was conserved and look for the highest and best use of that land parcel. And so everything we're talking about in Project 2 revolves around this highest and best use definition. And that's the reasonable, probable, and legal use of vacant land or an improved property that's legally permissible, physically possible, appropriately supported, financially feasible, and results in the highest value. And so for our Preservation Ranch case study that we're illustrating today, here's a snapshot of it's a very diverse land cover. It has great topographic relief. It also has a good diversity of land cover properties. And if we look back at that initial appraisal record, the highest and best use analysis is laid out in text form that needs a little bit of interpreting. So we read through that record and find out what sort of things could have been done on this parcel in terms of potential housing development and in terms of potential agriculture. And so the housing is going to be low density housing, and the agriculture was likely to be vineyards. So we say, by looking at this original appraisal of Preservation Ranch, we look at determine the highest and best use. 190 potential acres of vineyards could have taken place on existing grasslands, and 154 potential housing units, under the assumption that the county wouldn't have changed zoning in this particular area. So given this type and amount of conversion, what are the vegetation types and hence the carbon that would have been affected? So we need to make some assumptions here. And we say for vineyards, we assume this conversion happens on grasslands. For housing, we look at the conversion trajectories derived from Sonoma County as a whole during this period. And we use those percentages from Sonoma County to guide what vegetation types would have been converted on the ranch. And so all of this work ties back to some common GIS data products. As Patrick mentioned in the previous work, the carbon work that he's talking about is driven by this land fire product, as is the work that we're doing in Project 2. And so if we look at these potential, we're just looking at housing here, but if we look at the potentials for housing development Sonoma County wide, we see this array of conversions. And if we apply those same conversions to what we have on Preservation Ranch, we get this array of different types of conversions. So the potential development is about 154 homes, and that equates to about 308 acres. So given this, we can do some scenario playing and look at Preservation Ranch and all the other parcels that we're going to examine and say, okay, let's look at what it looked like, and then let's look at what it might look like if these things had been converted. So from the existing acres of annual grassland, 190 acres of those would be converted to vineyard, and 308 acres would be converted from all those existing land types. And so in this way, we can look at, using the work that Patrick's done, what are the carbon ramifications across these kinds of changes. And then additionally, the next steps that we'll do is think about the uncertainty associated with which vegetation classes would convert, as well as the uncertainty around if this highest and best use would have actually come to fruition.
Thank you. And the final project is a closer examination of the problem of land management and the challenge of land management in coastal grasslands, and particularly really trying to take a close look at some of the below ground carbon quantification that needs greater attention in this area. And this will be presented by Wendy Silver.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. So we're going to be using the DACENT ecosystem and biogeochemical model to try to understand how carbon is stored in ecosystems both above and below ground, although we focus a lot of our attention below ground, and also put that in the context of greenhouse gas fluxes. So really understanding the whole system and looking at it from a very holistic perspective. We have picked 4 sites that are representative of different climate zones, and I'll show you a map of those in just a minute. We will parameterize the model using data from these sites. We have been looking through the literature and contacting people, as well as using some of our own data to parameterize the model. This will allow us to simulate the response of soil carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and plant dynamics in these sites across a range of future climate scenarios, with the background condition being grazing. So all of these are grazed grasslands. And then we also will be simulating the response of the ecosystems to future management, including things like compost amendments, which is something we've done a lot of research on, manure amendments, which is really practices, business as usual practice that a lot of rangelands, particularly dairy rangelands, are using today, and also explore the potential to use biochar, which is an activity that a lot of managers are looking into. So in the next slide, you'll see a map of the sites that we're using. And we chose these sites because they present a matrix of different climate and soil conditions across the state that are representative. In other words, they allow us to use the data that will come out of the model to scale and understand how carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics are varying along the coast of California. And I should mention that we're coupling this project with another project that's funded by the 4th assessment by the state that's modeling inland grasslands. And so that'll allow us to fill in climate and soil conditions and plant cover type conditions that may not be represented strictly by these 4 coastal sites. So with that, those additional 13 to 15 locations will be able to understand, I think, fairly well the potential future climate and carbon interactions for the coast. And then finally, I just wanted to give you an example of what the output from these models will look like. This is from data from a paper of a former graduate student of mine, Riles et al., where we looked at compost amendments, different management approaches to compost amendments in inland and coastal grassland, and looked at the rate at which that compost disappears. That's the graph on the left, decomposition versus change in ecosystem carbon, how long that increase in ecosystem carbon will last, and where that carbon is going in the soil, which gives us an indication of the climate change, long-term climate change impact of different management practices.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you, David, Patrick, and Maggie. So now we're turning to the second half of our webinar, and it's time for your clarifying questions about what we've just gone through, or your questions about how this could best help your work moving forward, the products that our team is going to be putting together. So we're going to switch. We had a little glitch or two with GoToMeeting this morning, so you're going to see a screen that we're seeing as well. You'll see behind the scenes here. And we're not going to unmute people and go through all that because we have quite a few on the call. But please type your question in the chat function, and we will get to them. There's a question about the slides. Yes, we've recorded the webinar, and we will send out a link by the end of the week that will show you where you can see the slides and also listen to the audio. So let's scroll down. And David, you want to take one?
No, Sarah Moore. Yes.
Yeah. SCC equals Coastal Conservancy. Yes. State Coastal Conservancy. They are supporting and funding the project. So if you can just So this is the time to write your questions in here and talk to the team here about what they're going to do and how it might help your work. Can we go down a little further? Okay. What'd you say, David?
Can you make me the presenter?
That would be asking a question live. So we're just doing chat questions here for now. Okay.
There's a new question.
Oh, they're coming that way.
So for Patrick, first question here. What hypotheses as the cause of net carbon loss across veg stocks in the decade are being analyzed?
I had mentioned that we further looked at this and found that the 6% of the wildland area of the state that had burned in that period produced 2/3 of the greenhouse gases. And wildfire is a natural and necessary part of forest ecosystems in the state. But we're living now with a legacy of a century of unnatural fire suppression. And so we have overstocked forests, unnatural accumulations of litter, and small trees in the understory. So it's this legacy of this unnatural legacy that we'll need to deal with, a pulse of carbon emissions, because policies have changed in the National Park Service and the state. We're using fire proactively to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire in the future. And eventually, if our fire management is successful, ecosystems will return to an appropriate fire regime, and we'll have larger, bigger, older trees that will eventually store more carbon than was lost in these periodic fires.
Thank you, Patrick. And please type your questions in the chat function on the screen. And our second question comes from Ann Moorkill, and Wendy's going to answer it. Want to repeat the question?
Okay, sure. So the question is, there it is. Will you also be considering the SEC's coastal marsh properties, e.g. protecting increasing existing marshes, sorry, I can't read with the blue, or converting to former salt ponds to tidal marsh as opposed to filling for development? That's a great idea. That isn't something that we had planned on looking at. We are looking at some sites that have that are very carbon rich, and actually, I'm part of another project that's looking at conversion of delta lands, both into and out of agriculture. So looking at flooding and establishment of wetlands for carbon sequestration, and also the draining of wetlands. So some of that is already available, and we did use the same model to model that, and we published that a couple of years ago. I'm happy to share that publication. And one of our sites that we're going to be doing as part of the broader project is on delta lands. So I think it's Rush Ranch, which will allow us to also look at, to have some background information to potentially model that in the future.
Great. Thank you, Wendy.
I'll just add, yeah, 1 second. I will just add one thing. We certainly will be evaluating what percent of this footprint of the Coastal Conservancy is in different habitat types, such as wetland, grassland, and that'll form a baseline for saying, okay, certainly an important next step, given that it's X% of the land would be in this habitat, and that analysis is probably tomorrow. Just didn't quite get it ready for today.
Great. Keep your questions coming on the chat function. And the next one is Christian Hayes.
I just wanted to add briefly to what Wendy said, in that the first part of the research that you saw, we did include wetlands, and so during that period, if wetlands expanded or if they were removed from a natural state, it shows up in the carbon numbers.
Thank you, Patrick. Next question: how are you measuring baseline carbon?
Baseline can refer to two things, and the first thing is just the 2001 base carbon data from which we're starting. So that's one baseline. The other sense of baseline is the last part of the research, where we're looking at future projections of what might happen or what might have happened with development and other conversion activities. And in that case, baseline is what would have happened in the absence of protection by the California Coastal Commission. And that was covered by Maggie in that section.
Thank you, Patrick. And the next question about the Department of Conservation and their efforts.
I'm going to give a more generic and less specific answer, which is that this webinar is one part of open up conversations, with other interested parties, including hopefully many of you. And, we've got our work cut out for us, and we're focused on that in the short run, but we certainly are open to seeing where this leads if it's of assistance to other agencies. And Hillary, do you want to add anything? Or?
Okay. So just to add, as David said, this is a process, and we are reaching out to all of you on the webinar, but we'll be reaching out to other potential partners and allies as we move through the project timeline. So you see my email, bruce@climatereadinessinstitute.org, on the screen. If you send me an email today with a suggestion for other partners and other stakeholders that we should be in conversation with, please do that. Okay, next question. And David's going to take the next one. To repeat the question.
I'm just going to hand it to Wendy.
Okay, so the question is, how would coastal wetlands compare to other landscapes as a carbon sink? And coastal wetlands have huge potential to act as a carbon sink, we think, especially if you take land that was previously drained and you reflooded it. But there's a real trade-off with methane emissions. And so that's the real catch, is whether or not they're a net carbon sink. As opposed to just increasing soil carbon storage, you need to take into account the greenhouse gas emissions and the warming potential of each gas. So that's being studied currently. And what our previous data showed is that there is carbon storage, especially in the early part of wetland development, as they begin to gain all that soil carbon. But the methane emissions offset a significant amount of that. And as those wetlands get older, that balance begins to change. So we're hoping to study more of those older wetlands to see if they're a better net climate mitigation tool. And then the next question, I think also has to do with soils. It says, besides soil amendments applied to grasslands under grazing regimes, what is the typical net carbon of rangelands with highly productive annual grasslands with more than 2,000 pounds per acre annual production, for example, under heavily managed settings, e.g. short-term high stocking? Again, net carbon with, oops, it just moved, sorry.
It's okay.
Again, net carbon with heavy managed annual grasslands without adding compost, biochar, or manure, besides what is being produced by the livestock on the range. So, and then it says, preferably this question in the geography of the Central Valley and less than 10 inches of rainfall per year. Wow, that's very specific. So here's the deal. There's, I really wish that short duration, high intensity grazing was the panacea that we all hoped it was going to be, but there's no scientific data to support that approach actually increases soil carbon storage or ecosystem carbon storage. We've done one study, it's not published yet, where we worked with a rancher who was using the technique, and we compared that with treatment with control and treatment plots over the course of 6 years, and we're not able to detect any significant effect except potentially a small loss in carbon and a lot of soil compaction. I know that this has been in the press a lot. I know that there's a really phenomenal TED Talk, which really led us to try to look for data, and we are not finding that data. That's not to say that improved grazing can't necessarily increase soil carbon stocks, and that's something that we're also hopefully going to explore in the future with modeling.
Great. Thank you, Wendy. And Kim, Are there recommendations for baseline measuring of bare soils prior to restoration of agriculture to native plant communities? Who wants to take that one?
I feel like it's back on you, Wendy.
Oh, okay.
Wendy Silver.
Sorry, here we go.
Methods.
Okay. Let me read that again. Are there recommendations for baseline measuring in bare soils prior to restoration of agriculture to native plant communities? Yeah, this has been something that's received a lot of attention, and we just published a paper this year. It came out in Ecosphere and is publicly available. I don't know, maybe we can post it on the website, where we worked with two card-carrying, well-respected plant community ecologists, because I'm a biogeochemist. And while I know a couple of these species, I don't know all of them. Katie Suding and Val Evner, both who have a lot of experience here in California. And what we found was that the practices that we were looking at, which were compost amendments, did not decrease biodiversity and did not significantly increase the occurrence of exotic invasive weeds. It is something that we definitely care a lot about. And there was a little bit of evidence, very marginally statistically significant, that suggested at the coastal site that you could increase some perennial grasses with compost application. Now, the problem is that these species are rare enough that we don't get a lot of individuals. So I don't put a lot of stock in those results until we start to see it in other places and over time. But it was something that was very interesting. There may be approaches to help foster native species in agricultural lands, and I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, so I will pass that over to others. Anybody else want to comment?
Well, the natives and the invasives are all made of carbon. I'm not sure I've got it at my fingertips at the moment for the question. I think the community ecology is interesting, non-trivial, and complex, and I bet the people listening collectively have as much expertise as the people in the room. So good topic.
Okay.
One to keep on the agenda.
Next question.
There's a question just about the California climate types map. We've been having a lot of fun making those maps. Obviously, they aren't actually the first climate type maps of California, but we've been trying to accomplish some slightly different goals. Certainly, we can make images available. Always cautious about releasing GIS layers if they're not something that you're going to commit to and publish. So we'll work on that, but they're fun maps to look at. I'll just briefly say that the method we're using, we're trying to have a hierarchical method where you can keep drilling down to finer and finer landscapes, and the types keep being subdivisions of the types above, so that it's a method that can work across scales, which may be useful and valuable. We skipped over a question about seed sources. I felt like maybe we had kind of stumbled along to it, talking about the invasives and the natives. But Wendy, in your work, are you worrying about the?
Yeah. So with regard to the composting, we've done so composting, if it's done right, and we're only using commercial grade composting and from commercial composters, that kills seeds. And so this stuff gets heated to very, very high temperatures, and we've done trials to see if anything germinates out of these compost piles after they're done composting, and we're not seeing anything that's germinating out of those compost piles. So it's not a problem.
I think, just quickly, I think Kim's question, Wendy, was about baseline carbon. Baseline measurements for, we wandered off into invasive and native species.
Oh, whoops, sorry. So baseline, are there any recommendations for baseline measuring of carbon? Actually, yeah. So people are putting together, meaning me and a lot of other people, putting together a group of folks putting together a soil sampling protocol to get baseline soil carbon measurements. And we will be able to share that fairly soon.
Great. Thanks, Wendy. Next question. Where should we go?
I think the Stillwater.
Yeah, this is Patrick.
Okay.
This is Sarah Moore.
Yeah. So a question from Sarah Moore for Patrick.
Can you hear? Sarah asks.
We're not seeing that question.
Oh, sorry.
This is
no, it's on the screen, Patrick.
This is a previous one we want.
Patrick has said Coastal Commission a few times.
Conservancy.
Oh gosh.
Yeah.
I apologize for the error. Yeah,
It's
it's Coastal Conservancy.
Yeah.
So Stillwater Sciences asks for future work. Are you considering overlaying the carbon benefits with specifics of biodiversity, habitat, landscape continuity? And I can talk about, carbon is only one of the services that ecosystems provide, and that's the focus of this. I can give an example in the National Park Service. We actually use this exact California carbon data. We've combined it with climate change vulnerability to biome shifts with species richness, biodiversity, and corridor needs in collaboratively with other agencies, developing a map of potential areas to acquire for protection in the future. And that's one example of one of the further uses of this. David Ackerley here is part of another project that's looking at connectivity of biodiversity and protected areas across the state of California. And so I'm sure they'll be considering this carbon data in their work too.
Yeah, this is David. As academics, we'll just say in the future, everything's on the table, right? The future is wide open. I think we're all heading into new territory. We're trying to combine things that have not all been, all in our hands at the same time. It's not always easy. Each project has its own parameters and its own sort of language. And often it depends on how great the interest is among both researchers and agencies in bringing together different kinds of projects. So I'd always say everything's on the table if the interest levels are high.
And John Battles is going to take the next question, I believe. John?
Yeah, so the question is from the Pacific Forest Trust. It's in the second project on land use and avoided emissions, will you also consider the potential sea gains from improved management after conservation? Yeah, that's definitely the case. A lot of the Coastal Commission lands is in rangelands and in forests. The Garcia comes to mind, and that clearly diverted the path when the Garcia Forest Preserve came online, and when that was an industrial timber site. So that'll be the alternative scenario. There won't be housing development in vineyards. It'll be if it continued along an industrial sort of a timber company, and that would be the different scenarios, and we'll be able to evaluate the carbon consequences of those differences, and it'll using the same kind of methodology that Patrick outlined. It works quite well for that, actually.
And this is David. I'll just add that I think our belief, having not dug into the details, is that some of those lands are under such intensive study that we won't need to do new analysis for some of that work, because some of the forests that are already being managed for carbon credits, those analyses are being done under established protocols, and we won't be reinventing the wheel on that.
Great. Keep those questions coming. And like we said, we're having a little glitch with GoToMeeting, but we'll get to all the questions as we go through the webinar. Hillary Willicka is going to take the next one from Hillary Pappendick. Hillary?
So the question is, are there other local government in California incorporating carbon sequestration projects in their climate action plan? And I don't specifically know an answer to that question, but the local government taking action with carbon sequestration, we do have a couple of the Conservancy climate ready grants on regional carbon farming planning and sequestering carbon in California soils with the Marin County RCD. And we've had the city of Arcata also had funding from the Conservancy for forest acquisition in their Sunnybreak community. So those are ways local governments can take action in carbon sequestration.
Great. And this is Bruce. Just to add, if you haven't looked already at the governor's 6 pillars for climate change on the state website, carbon sequestration is now one of the 6 pillars. So we're on the map. We're moving forward. There's a lot more attention, as many of you know, being paid at the state level to these issues. Okay, this is great with questions. You're doing very well. We've got 15 more minutes, and the next question will be for Maggie Kelly.
So the question is, will you be standardizing your methodology for Project 2, that calculating avoided emissions, and distributing that so others can perform similar analysis? So we'll be doing our best methodology across all of the properties that we're choosing. I don't know specifically what you mean by standardizing the methodology. We'll present the methods that we're going to be using for this so that they can perform, that others can perform it. But if you have a follow-up on what you actually mean by standardizing the methodology, we'll try to take a crack at that. And I will point out that Dr. Van Butzik couldn't make this webinar. He's the one who's leading this avoided emissions work, and he's a land change scientist. So I'll be forwarding also the questions that relate to this to him.
Can you get the next one? It comes down to whether we know which acres are being covered.
Okay, so and the next question is, in studying the potential change in carbon in the preservation ranch with development of vineyards and housing, have you taken into account the potential for timber conversion into vineyards? Yeah, so this is a really good point. In reading the appraisal document, the appraisal, that's our guide for this one. The appraisal document is clear that the vineyards should be expanded onto grasslands, and they're sufficient. So we haven't taken into consideration the potential for timber conversion into vineyards in this case. But in the final slide of Project 2 that I showed you, we are looking at the sort of uncertainties around these kind of land cover, land use transitions that might come into play with the conversions.
Thank you, Maggie. Next question. David, who's going to take the next one here? John Battles.
Okay, so the question is, along with the Department of Conservation, I wonder if this research can be aligned with the work that the Natural Resource Agency, Air Resource Board, and CAL FIRE are doing on quantifying methodology for the State Forest Carbon Plan. And definitely yes. The approach we're using now that Patrick was leading is the best we have. And as part of the fourth assessment, there's another effort to see how can we improve these estimates, particularly at the finer scale, to make them more robust, and exploring different kinds of technology to do that. Again, that the idea is to have an approach, a carbon accounting approach that works for the entire state, not just the Coastal Conservancy. But a lot of my interest in working with this project is to make sure we're linking up, because one of the key unknowns is that we're not really linking up to the below ground carbon, which is much harder to measure and sense. And so this Conservation Conservancy program gives us a chance to try and link the two up. And it's really a good chance to learn with Wendy's group to put the above ground and below ground together. And so that's our hope going forward.
Just a quick follow-up by David. It's important to recognize that the state doesn't all sit in a room and coordinate their grants before they pass out the project. So we're all in real time in communication with the other projects, and also asking the same question of some of the agencies: are you all talking to each other, and are you directing and asking for what kind of coordination? So this will all unfold in real time, parts of it over the next year, and of course continuing.
Next question. Okay. More questions, folks. We have a few more minutes here, and these are terrific questions for the panel. And looks like we're getting one from Abby Halperin. She's posed the proverbial what? We could do who or when.
Yeah, the answer is, well, we know the answer is 42.
I thought we answered
how, but you want to keep going? There we go. What's the time frame for your research outputs? Let's talk about the time frame. That's a very good question. Because we have different pieces of the project coming along at different times. Yeah.
Yes, we do. Actually, I'm afraid I won't give the details. It's on the time frame of a year. This grant. I'm sorry, I actually don't have the couple checkpoints along the way of what we'll be releasing. But I think for public products, think about it on the timescale of a year. The internal checkpoints are more for within the group. So.
And we are planning to have maybe a second webinar that we could do partway again through the project, maybe at the halfway point. So that would be another potential spot where we could share some of initial findings as we're going through the year, and we'll have to see how that goes.
Just David again, a quick follow-up just for context, that we're actually just starting the project. We're really only in the first month or two, and we wanted to offer the webinar so people saw where we were headed. So that 1 year is not the end of a 3-year time frame. That is our time frame. It's a 1 year, and it's and we I think have taken on quite a few things, so it will keep us busy.
Okay. Here, take it back. People are leaving. Thank you for your questions. Very good questions for the panel. And thank you to our presenters, David Ackerley, Patrick Gonzalez, Maggie Kelly, Wendy Silver. We have one more. There's still time. Come on down. John Gallo has a question for all, and let's see who's going to answer this one. Wendy? Wendy Silver.
Chicken and egg problem. I thought it was called.
Okay, let's see. The question is, in conversations about scaling up the use of soil amendments like compost and manure, there is often a chicken and egg problem. Counties, et cetera, are often hesitant to commit upfront resources to create the large-scale plants programs. Can you consider doing an analysis that takes a stab at the acreage within the Coastal Conservancy jurisdiction or pilot counties that are suitable prime for amendments? Yes, absolutely. I'm hoping that that's going to be an outcome of this project, is really to look at what the carbon sequestration potential is across a range of soil, climate, cover type, and management conditions. And with that, we should be able to come up with some good information that people can use to put together planning.
Bruce, you up for the next one?
I have a couple more here. Will you provide a list of potential funding sources for conservation work that sequesters carbon? We'll have to think on that one. We don't have a list right now, but we'll look and see. Get back to you. And a question from Virginia Lorne. Who wants to take this one? David?
I'll read the question. Well, the Trust for Public Land acquires land for conservation and often faces the question of quantifying how acquisitions would impact carbon sequestration or otherwise address climate change. The information provided today would greatly assist us with scientific backing as we justify conservation versus highest and best use. And what you're saying is that you're in the same business, and we certainly understand that the Coastal Conservancy is not alone. And what I think the opportunity we have is to take this opportunity with this set of footprints to develop our methods and then open the conversation with other agencies who face similar situations. But not all the results simply spill out, immediately to the next set of lands. So each one will take some discussion and thought about how to apply it to other spatial domains and other acquisitions. But we're certainly glad that you see the potential and share the interest in the direction we're headed with this work.
And that is a good ending question and comment. That is a lot of why we wanted to do this webinar with you today. Thank you for joining us. If you have a specific comment or question offline, send it to my email that's right on the screen, bruce@climatereadinessinstitute.org. We will be posting within a week the recording of this on the CRI website and a couple of other spots. Again, thanks to David Ackerley, Patrick Gonzalez, Maggie Kelly, Wendy Silver, and Isabel Schroeder. And thanks very much to Hillary Waleka and the Coastal Conservancy for funding the project. And we thank you for staying with us for this webinar today. And that closes our webinar live and direct from Mulford Hall on the campus of the University of California, the Berkeley campus. Thank you, and have a good day.